When survival demands a choice, which weighs heavier, a stranger's promise or your own breath? The creak whispered at 6:30, 2 feet below yesterday's mark on the cottonwood. Sarah Brennan folded the marriage paper along its worn creases and tucked it inside her hat box, beside the dried lavender and her mother's pearl buttons. The paper crackled like autumn leaves a sound that meant freedom or foolishness, depending on how the morning played. She'd read Thomas Garrity's proposal 3 times since dawn. Miss Brennan, I have need of a wife for my homestead outside Millfield. I am 32, temperate in drink, and possess 160 acres under cultivation. If you find this arrangement suitable, reply by Wednesday's post. No mention of love, no promise of tenderness, just acres and temperance and the desperate mathematics of frontier survival, practical as a plough horse, she murmured, watching the creek carry twigs and leaves toward the Solomon River. The water moved faster this morning, stirring the clay bottom until the stream ran rust-colored in the early light. Mrs. Henley's voice drifted from the boarding-house kitchen. Sarah, the breakfast won't serve itself. Sarah lifted the hat box and felt the marriage paper shift inside a weight lighter than a coin, but heavier than all her doubts combined. She had until Wednesday to decide whether to trade her position as kitchen help for a stranger's homestead, whether to exchange the boarding house's familiar routines for the vast uncertainties of married life. The creek gurgled higher now, lapping at roots that had been dry yesterday. The depot clock showed 8:15 when Sarah entered Henley's kitchen with flour dust on her apron and creek mud on her boots. The boarding house buzzed with its morning rhythm, 6 residents requiring eggs, bacon, and strong coffee before they scattered to the grain elevator, the post office, the surveyor's tent on Main Street. That water's rising faster than I've seen, said Mr. Pickering, the land agent, mopping egg yolk with his biscuit. Creek's been behaving strange all week. Sarah poured his coffee and glanced toward the window. The cottonwood marker that had shown 2 feet of clearance now showed 18 inches. Spring melt from up north, maybe. Too early for melt, too warm for snowpack. Pickering counted out 15 cents for his meal, exact change as always. Something's stirring upstream. Mark my words. Mrs. Henley appeared in the doorway, her grey hair pinned with military precision. Sarah, take the laundry down before noon. That creek keeps climbing, we'll lose the washing line. Sarah nodded and retreated to the pantry, where she kept the hat box hidden behind sacks of cornmeal. She lifted the lid and touched the marriage paper's edge. The ink had faded slightly. Thomas Garrity's careful script softened by time and handling, 160 acres under cultivation. She pictured neat furrows, a solid cabin. Children who would call her mother instead of ma'am. The depot whistle shrieked once, sharp and urgent the signal for incoming telegraph messages. By 8:30, word spread through the boarding house like spilled water. The Solomon River had jumped its banks 20 miles upstream. Mill Creek, Fancy Creek, and every tributary between here and Junction City were running high and fast. The afternoon train might be delayed. The evening stage would certainly find road trouble. Sarah folded the marriage paper and returned it to its place among the pearl buttons. Wednesday's post seemed both too far away and racing toward her like floodwater. The laundry hung limp in the humid air, sheets and pillowcases strung between cottonwoods whose roots now touched the rising creek. Sarah worked quickly, pinning the last of Mrs. Henley's tablecloths while glancing over her shoulder at the water that climbed another inch every hour. A stranger approached along the creek path, tall, lean, with a doctor's bag in one hand and a horse's reins in the other. His coat bore road dust, and his boots were caked with mud from a dozen stream crossings. He moved with the careful efficiency of a man who'd ridden hard and expected to ride harder before the day ended. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim, "I'm looking for the boarding house. Dr. Marcus Webb, from Junction City." "You found it," Sarah said, gesturing toward the 3-story building that dominated this end of Main Street. "Though, if you're planning to stay, you'd best hurry." Mrs. Henley fills her rooms by 9 o'clock most mornings. He studied the creek, noting its speed and color. "I'm not here for lodging. Came to check on reports of illness, fever, and stomach trouble down in the bottoms. But this flood business might complicate things." The creek gurgled against the cottonwood roots, 6 inches higher than when Sarah had started hanging laundry. How bad is it upstream? Bad enough that I spent the night in my saddle, dodging washouts and fallen trees. The Solomons running like a locomotive, carrying everything from cabin roofs to cattle. Dr. Webb's eyes found the laundry line, calculating. You might want to move those sheets somewhere drier. Sarah began unpinning the damp linens, working faster now. The town's been through floods before, not like this one. He secured his horse to a fence post well back from the water. I've seen what's coming downstream. This isn't just spring runoff, something gave way up north. Dam, maybe, or a beaver pond that couldn't hold. The marriage paper rustled in the hat box as Sarah shifted it to her other arm, balancing the basket of rescued laundry. Thomas Garrity's homestead lay 15 miles east, on higher ground near the bluffs, safe from floodwater, safe from the uncertainties that plagued river towns during wet seasons. Dr. Webb's horse snorted and pulled against its reins, ears pricked towards some sound Sarah couldn't hear. "What is it?" she asked. The doctor cocked his head, listening. Then Sarah heard it too, a low rumble from the north, like distant thunder that never stopped. The wall of water rounded the bend at 11:23, carrying a freight wagon's splintered box and the roof of Henderson's chicken coop. Sarah had time to scream once before the flood swept her off the creek bank, tumbling her into the cold rush that tasted of mud and fear, and the long journey from upstream disasters. The hat box flew from her arms, spinning once before the current seized it. She watched her mother's pearl buttons scatter like white seeds, the marriage paper unfolding as it danced away on brown water that cared nothing for her careful plans or Wednesday's post. The creek had become a river. The river had become a monster. Sarah's skirts dragged her down, heavy wool transformed into an anchor that pulled her beneath the surface. She kicked frantically, lungs burning, hands clawing toward a light that seemed impossibly distant. The current rolled her like a log, battering her against submerged fence posts and the tangled remains of someone's garden gate. Her chest seized. Water filled her mouth, her nose pressing into her lungs with the weight of drowning. The world narrowed to a tunnel of brown liquid, and the dull roar of her own heartbeat slowing, skipping, stopping. This is dying, she thought, as darkness closed around her like a fist. Then hands found her ribs strong, sure hands that lifted her toward air and light, and the desperate possibility of another breath. "Doctor!" Webb's face appeared above her, water streaming from his hair, his mouth moving in words she couldn't hear over the flood's thunder. "Count backwards from 10. He shouted, pressing his palms against her chest in a steady rhythm that matched the beat she'd lost. 10. Her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. 9. His hands pushed life back into her lungs. 8. She coughed up creek water and gasped for air that tasted sweeter than honey. 7. The depot bell rang frantically, calling help that couldn't come. By the count of 3, Sarah Brennan was breathing on her own, clinging to a cottonwood branch, while the stranger who'd saved her life held her steady against the current that wanted to reclaim her. They clung to the cottonwood for 2 hours, watching the flood carry away pieces of the town Sarah had called home for 3 years. Henderson's chicken coop sailed past, followed by a schoolhouse desk and someone's Sunday hat. The water ran coffee brown and fast, 20 feet beyond its normal banks, transforming familiar landmarks into temporary islands. Dr. Webb kept one arm around Sarah's waist and used the other to maintain his grip on the tree. His shirt had torn during the rescue, and she could see the steady rise and fall of his breathing, controlled, patient, like a man accustomed to waiting through medical crises. "The boarding house," Sarah said, craning her neck to see past the bend. "Mrs." Henley's 3-story building stood on higher ground, but the water lapped at its front steps now, creeping toward the kitchen where breakfast dishes still waited in the sink. "She'll be fine," Dr. Webb said. "Building's solid, and she's got enough supplies to last a week if needed." "My things," Sarah started, then stopped. "What things?" The hat box with her mother's buttons lay somewhere downstream, probably snagged in a fence line or buried in creek-bottom mud. The marriage paper had dissolved into pulp, taking Thomas Garrity's practical proposal with it. Her one spare dress, her prayer book, her small savings all trapped in a boarding house, surrounded by floodwater. "We'll worry about possessions later," the doctor said. Right now, we need to reach high ground before this tree gives way. As if summoned by his words, the cottonwood shuddered. Its root system, undermined by rushing water, began to shift. Sarah felt the tree lean slightly downstream, branches creaking under their combined weight. "Can you swim?" Dr. Webb asked. "Some. Not well. Then we'll make for that ridge." He pointed toward a line of limestone bluffs 50 yards east dry land that promised safety, but required crossing the worst of the current. "I'll stay close. Don't fight the water. Let it carry you sideways until we can angle toward shore." The tree lurched. Sarah's hand slipped on the wet bark, and for a moment she dangled by one arm before Dr. Webb caught her wrist. "Now," he said. They pushed off together, surrendering to the flood that had already stolen so much. Sarah kicked her legs and pulled with her free arm, fighting the weight of her waterlogged clothes, while the doctor swam beside her with the powerful strokes of someone who'd learned swimming as medicine, a skill that might save lives when rivers turned treacherous. The current swept them downstream, even as they struggled toward the eastern shore. Sarah's lungs burned from the effort, and her legs cramped from the cold water that seemed to leach warmth from her bones. "But Doctor," Webb's hand never left her arm, and his voice carried clearly over the flood's roar. "Breathe steady. Don't panic. Almost there." Her feet touched bottom at 12:47, guided by the depot clock that somehow still chimed the hours from its tower above the flood line. She staggered onto the muddy shore and collapsed, gasping, while Dr. Webb hauled his medical bag from the shallows and checked its contents for water damage. Behind them, the cottonwood crashed into the current with a sound like breaking bones. The limestone ridge offered safety and a clear view of the disaster below. Sarah wrung water from her skirts and watched the flood reshape her world, turning streets into canals and familiar buildings into islands. The grain elevator stood firm, built on high ground with deep foundations, but Miller's store had water halfway up its front windows. Dr. Webb spread his coat on a flat rock and inventoried his medical supplies. Most had stayed dry in their oiled leather case, but his bottle of laudanum had cracked, leaking brown liquid that smelled of bitter medicine and lost possibilities. "People will need help," he said, nodding toward the stranded buildings. "Cuts, broken bones, shock from the cold water. Probably dysentery in a few days, once the well water gets contaminated." Sarah shivered in her wet dress, aware suddenly of how she must look. Hair hanging in tangled ropes, mud streaked across her face, her best apron torn and stained beyond saving. "I can help. I know most folks in town, know who's got children or ailments that might complicate things. You nearly drowned an hour ago, but I didn't." She stood, testing her legs. "Wobbly, but strong enough. You saved me. Seems like I ought to return the favor somehow." Dr. Webb studied her with the clinical attention he might give a patient, noting her color, her breathing, the steadiness of her hands. "You'll need dry clothes, food, shelter. The town needs a doctor more than I need comfort." He smiled then, the first real warmth she'd seen in his face since they'd met by the creek that morning. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Stubborn as a mule and twice as useful in a crisis." The depot whistle shrieked, 3 times the emergency signal that meant all hands to rescue work. Across the flood, Sarah could see people on rooftops and upper-story windows, waving anything bright enough to signal their locations. Mrs. Henley's boarding house showed movement behind its second-floor windows, but the water had risen to cover the front door completely. "There," Sarah pointed. "The widow Patterson's place. 2 streets over. She's got 4 children under 10, and her husband died last winter. If the water reached her cabin..." Dr. Webb shouldered his medical bag and started down the ridge toward the flood's edge. "Then we'd better find a way to get across this mess." Sarah followed, her bare feet finding purchase on limestone ledges still warm from the morning Sunday. The marriage paper was gone, dissolved into creek water that had carried away her careful plans for Wednesday's post. But Thomas Garrity's homestead seemed less important now than the immediate work of helping people survive the next few hours. She'd been saving her life for some future happiness. Today, life was saving other people. The flood stretched before them like a brown lake, dotted with rooftops and trees, dangerous and unpredictable, but not impossible to cross. Dr. Webb was already studying the current, plotting a route from island to island, building to building, toward the places where help was needed most. They found the widow Patterson clinging to her kitchen table on the cabin's roof, her 4 children arranged around her like compass points. The youngest, barely 3, had stopped crying and stared at the water with the blank expression that meant shock was setting in. Doctor, Webb balanced on the peak of Patterson's chicken coop, which had lodged against the cabin's south wall when the flood hit. He passed his medical bag to Sarah, then reached for the widow's outstretched hand. Mrs. Patterson, I'm Dr. Webb. Are any of the children hurt? Little Mary took a knock when we climbed through the window, she said, indicating the youngest girl. Been quiet ever since. And James cut his hand on something sharp. Sarah examined the boy's palm while Dr. Webb lifted the silent 3-year-old. The cut was clean but deep, still bleeding despite the mother's attempts to bandage it with torn fabric from her apron. This needs stitching, Sarah said. But the bleeding's good means no major damage inside. Dr. Webb nodded approvingly. You know something about wound care. My father was a veterinarian. Different patients, same principles. She wrapped the boy's hand with gauze from the medical bag, working quickly while the makeshift platform swayed under their combined weight. The little girl in Dr. Webb's arms remained eerily still, her breathing shallow and her skin cool despite the afternoon warmth. He examined her pupils, checked her pulse, ran gentle fingers along her skull until he found the swelling behind her left ear. Concussion, he said quietly. For Sarah's ears only. Mild, but she needs rest and careful watching. Any vomiting or strange behavior could mean trouble. Mrs. Patterson heard anyway, with the sharp ears that mothers developed when their children face danger. Will she be all right? With proper care, yes. But we need to get all of you somewhere dry and warm. The depot bell chimed 2 o'clock, its bronze voice carrying clearly across the flood. Sarah counted the emergency signals, 5 short rings, 3 long ones, repeated twice. Someone had organized a rescue effort, probably using the grain elevator as a coordination point, since it stood highest and driest. There, she pointed toward a rowboat picking its way between submerged fence posts. Looks like help's coming. The boat held 3 men, the postmaster, Jake Morrison from the livery stable, and a stranger Sarah didn't recognize. They rowed with grim efficiency, following a route that hugged the deeper channels while avoiding the worst debris. Every few minutes, they'd stop at a rooftop or upper window, taking on passengers and supplies before continuing toward the next stranded family. Ho there! Jake called out when he spotted their group. How many? 6 total, Dr. Webb replied. 1 injured child, 1 with possible head trauma. Priority evacuation. The boat angled toward them, its occupants working hard against a current that wanted to sweep them downstream toward the railroad bridge and whatever obstacles waited beyond. Sarah helped transfer the children one by one, making sure each was securely seated before releasing her grip. Mrs. Patterson was the last to leave the roof, clutching a carpet bag that held whatever she'd managed to grab during the frantic climb to safety. She paused beside Sarah, water lapping at her ankles as the cabin settled deeper into the flood. Thank you, she said simply. Both of you. I don't know how to repay. No need, Sarah interrupted. Just take care of your children. That's payment enough. The rowboat pulled away, heavily loaded but riding steady in the hands of men who knew the river's moods, even when it wore flood's disguise. Sarah watched until they reached the grain elevator's loading dock, where other survivors waited with blankets and hot coffee. Dr. Webb studied the flood from their new vantage point atop the sinking cabin. 5 more houses down this street show signs of life. That's 20 people, maybe 30, before we can call this area clear. Then we'd better keep moving, Sarah said, though her legs shook with exhaustion and her wet dress clung like a second skin that chafed with every step. The doctor looked at her with something that might have been admiration. You sure you want to do this? It'll be dangerous work, and you've already been through enough today. Sarah thought of the marriage paper dissolving in floodwater, of Thomas Garrity's practical proposal, and the safe homestead that offered security, but not purpose. She thought of little Mary Patterson's silent shock and her brother's bleeding hand, of Mrs. Henley stranded in her boarding house, and all the other people who needed help more than she needed comfort. I'm sure, she said, They jumped together toward the next rooftop, landing hard on wet shingles that offered precarious footing, but a path forward through the disaster that had redefined her life in the space of a morning. By 4 o'clock, they'd rescued 11 people from 6 different buildings, working in careful coordination with the boat crews that ferry shuttled survivors to the grain elevator. Sarah's bare feet were cut and bleeding from the rough shingles and splintered boards, but she developed a rhythm for the rescue work. Spot the people, assess their condition, signal the boats, help with the evacuation while Dr. Webb handled the medical emergencies. They found old Mr. Carnegie trapped in his blacksmith shop, pinned under an anvil that had shifted when the flood undermined the building's floor joists. The water was waist-deep inside the shop and rising steadily, threatening to drown the old man before they could free him. "Lever," Dr. Webb said, studying the problem. "We need something long enough to lift the anvil and strong enough to hold the weight." Sarah waded through Carnegie's submerged workshop, feeling with her feet for tools that might help. Her toes found a pry bar, then a length of steel rod that might serve as a fulcrum. But the anvil weighed 300 pounds, and Carnegie was weakening from cold and shock. "Doc," Carnegie wheezed. Don't think," Dr. Webb interrupted firmly. "Save your strength for staying alive." The depot whistle shrieked again, 4 long blasts that meant immediate danger. Sarah looked toward the sound and saw what had prompted the warning. A second wave rolling downstream, bigger than the first, carrying the remains of an upstream dam or mill pond that had finally given way completely. "How long?" she asked. Dr. Webb followed her gaze and calculated quickly. 5 minutes. Maybe 6. Not enough time for the boats to reach them, not enough time to dig Carnegie free by conventional means. Sarah grabbed the pry bar and positioned it against the anvil's base, using a submerged stump as her fulcrum point. "On 3, she said. "You pull him clear." "Sarah, that bar won't hold. It doesn't need to hold long." She braced her feet against the shop's stone foundation and threw her weight against the bar. "Just long enough." Dr. Webb gripped Carnegie under his arms and nodded. 3. The pry bar bent but didn't break, lifting the anvil just high enough for the doctor to drag Carnegie clear. Sarah held the weight for a count of 10, muscles screaming, before the bar snapped and the anvil crashed back to the floor with a sound like thunder. The second wave hit as they reached the shop's doorway, a wall of brown water that lifted them off their feet and carried them toward the street in a chaos of floating debris and churning current. Sarah lost sight of Carnegie and Dr. Webb in the tumult, fighting to keep her head above water while the flood swept her past buildings she'd known since childhood. Something struck her head, a fence post or piece of lumber. The world tilted, filled with stars and the taste of blood. She felt herself sinking again, just as she had that morning by the creek. But this time, there were no strong hands to pull her toward the surface. "This is dying," she thought, for the second time that day. Then fingers closed around her wrist. "Doctor!" Webb's grip, sure and steady, even in the midst of the flood's violence. He hauled her against him, one arm around her waist, while he used the other to grab a passing roof beam that offered temporary flotation. "Carnegie?" she gasped. Safe. Caught onto Morrison's boat just downstream. The second wave carried them past the depot, past the grain elevator, into the maze of flooded streets south of the railroad tracks. Here the current was less fierce but more treacherous, full of hidden obstacles and sudden eddies that could trap the unwary. "Doctor!" Webb kicked steadily, towing her toward a church steeple that rose above the water like a beacon. They reached the church steps as the depot clock chimed 4:30. Sarah collapsed on the limestone stairs, coughing up flood water, while Dr. Webb checked her pupils for signs of concussion. His touch was gentle but clinical, the hands of someone trained to assess damage and calculate treatment options. "How many fingers?" he asked, holding up 3. 3. "And don't ask me to count backwards. I'm tired of counting." He smiled despite their circumstances. "Good. No serious head injury, but that cut on your scalp needs attention." The church door opened, revealing Reverend Matthews and his wife, both carrying blankets and steaming cups of coffee. Behind them, Sarah glimpsed other survivors, families she'd helped rescue, children wrapped in dry clothes, men discussing the flood's damage in voices that mixed shock with determination. "Dr. Webb," Reverend Matthews said. Thank God. We've got injured people inside, and Martha here has been doing her best with the first aid. But I'll look at them, the doctor said, accepting a blanket for Sarah. But first, this lady needs dry clothes and something warm to drink. She's been in the water twice today, and hypothermia's a real danger. Mrs. Matthews took Sarah's arm with the firm kindness of a woman accustomed to caring for strangers. Come inside, dear. We'll get you sorted out. Sarah looked back at Dr. Webb, who was already examining a child's broken arm with the focused attention she'd come to recognize. What about the rest of the rescues? Tomorrow, he said. The boats can't work safely after dark, and the current's still too strong. We've done what we can for today. As she followed Mrs. Matthews into the church, Sarah realized she felt no regret about the marriage papers' loss, no anxiety about Wednesday's post or Thomas Garrity's practical proposal. The flood had stolen her plans, but given her something unexpected, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with the immediate work of helping people survive. The church basement served as both refugee center and makeshift hospital, filled with survivors who'd lost everything except their lives. Sarah borrowed a dress from the Methodist lady's auxiliary blue wool, slightly too large, but clean and dry, and helped Mrs. Matthews distribute soup and coffee to families who'd been eating cold food since the flood hit. Dr. Webb worked steadily through his patients, setting bones and stitching cuts while maintaining a calm manner that helped ease the panic that came with displacement. Sarah found herself assisting without being asked, holding bandages and instruments, translating between the doctor's medical language and the plain words that frightened people could understand. That shoulder's dislocated, she told Mrs. Henderson, whose husband had wrenched his joint while climbing onto their roof. Doctor, Webb's going to put it back where it belongs, but it'll hurt for a moment. How do you know so much about doctoring? Henderson asked through gritted teeth. I'm learning, Sarah said simply. By 8 o'clock, they'd treated 17 patients and established a system for caring for the dozen children who'd been separated from their families during the evacuation. The youngest ones cried for mothers they couldn't find. The older ones sat quietly, understanding that tears wouldn't bring back houses or possessions or the familiar routines that had defined their lives before noon. Dr. Webb found Sarah in the church kitchen, helping with the evening meal preparation. She was slicing bread with mechanical precision, her movements efficient, despite the exhaustion that showed in her posture. You should rest, he said. You've done more than enough for one day. So have you. When did you last eat? He couldn't remember. The morning seemed like a week ago, and the simple routines of personal care, food, sleep, dry clothes felt less important than the immediate needs of people who'd lost everything. Sarah cut thick slices from a donated loaf and spread them with butter that the dairy had contributed to the relief effort. Simple food, but it tasted better than any meal she'd eaten in months. They sat together in the corner of the kitchen, too tired for conversation, but comfortable in the shared silence of people who'd worked hard and accomplished something worthwhile. The water's going down, Dr. Webb said eventually, nodding toward the basement windows that showed the flood's high watermarks on nearby buildings. Couple more feet, and people can start getting back into their houses to assess the damage. What about medical care? This many people displaced, somebody's going to get sick, and you can't stay forever. I can stay as long as needed. He met her eyes, and Sarah saw something there that hadn't been present that morning. A recognition, perhaps, or a question that neither of them was ready to ask directly. Reverend Matthews appeared in the kitchen doorway, his usually neat hair disheveled from the day's crisis management. Dr. Webb, there's a telegram for you. Came through on the emergency wire at the depot. The message was brief and official. Webb, return Junction City immediately. Cholera outbreak East County. Required your services. Medical board. Sarah read the telegram over his shoulder, noting the formal language that meant Dr. Webb's superiors considered his presence elsewhere more important than the flood relief work in their small town. When will you leave? She asked. First thing tomorrow, if I can find transportation. The railroad's probably washed out, but I might be able to get a horse from Morrison's stable. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the comfortable silence replaced by the awareness that their partnership was temporary, a crisis collaboration that would end when the emergency ended. Sarah had known this, of course, but knowing and feeling were different things entirely. "I'll help finish up here," she said, returning to the bread, slicing with renewed vigor. "Make sure everyone's settled for the night." Dr. Webb nodded and went back to his patients, leaving Sarah alone with the donated loaves and the growing certainty that tomorrow would require different decisions than the ones she'd been prepared to make at dawn. Sarah woke before sunrise on Thursday, her body stiff from sleeping on the church's hard pew, but her mind clear for the first time in days. Around her, other survivors stirred quietly, adjusting blankets and checking on children who'd finally found peaceful sleep after the trauma of evacuation. The floodwater had receded overnight, dropping 3 feet from its peak and revealing the true scope of the damage. Through the church windows, Sarah could see Main Street's muddy expanse littered with debris, broken furniture, uprooted trees, the scattered remains of lives interrupted by disaster. Dr. Webb was already awake, checking on the patients who'd needed overnight observation. Little Mary Patterson sat up in her makeshift bed, alert and responsive for the first time since the concussion. Her mother wept with relief while the doctor tested the child's reflexes and coordination. "She'll be fine," he told Mrs. Patterson. "Keep her quiet for a few days and watch for any signs of nausea or confusion." But the worst is past. Sarah approached with coffee and a plate of eggs that Mrs. Matthews had somehow managed to prepare on the church's ancient stove. "Breakfast, Doctor. And there's a man outside asking about hiring you for the ride to Junction City." Through the window, she could see a freight wagon hitched to a team of draft horses, its driver negotiating with Reverend Matthews about cargo space and travel rates. The wagon bed was already half full of mailbags and supplies heading east to communities that had been cut off by the flood. "That's my transportation, Doctor," Webb said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Driver says he can make Junction City by nightfall if we don't hit too many washouts. Then you'd better eat quickly." Sarah sat beside him on the church steps, watching the town begin its slow recovery. People emerged from the grain elevator and other refuge buildings, picking their way through the muddy streets toward homes they hoped might still be habitable. "What about you?" Dr. Webb asked. "Will you stay with the relief work or go back to the boarding house when things settle down?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question since midnight. Mrs. Henley's establishment would need extensive repairs before it could house guests again, and Sarah's position as kitchen help might not survive the economic disruption that always followed natural disasters. The marriage paper was gone, dissolved in floodwater, but Thomas Garrity's homestead remained practical security for a woman whose alternatives were increasingly limited. "I'm not sure," she said. "Yesterday changed things. Yesterday changed everything." Dr. Webb studied his hands, noting the cuts and stains that marked his work during the crisis. "I've been thinking about what you said about helping people. There's a lot of need for medical care out here. Places where a doctor visits maybe twice a year if the weather's good. You're thinking of staying? I'm thinking of expanding, setting up a proper practice instead of just answering emergency calls, but it would mean finding someone who knows the area, knows the people. Someone who's not afraid of hard work or unusual circumstances." Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "Someone like a doctor's assistant, you mean? Someone like a partner?" Medical training can be learned, but good judgment and genuine care, those are rarer qualities. The freight wagon driver called out, indicating his readiness to depart. "Doctor." Webb gathered his medical bag and the few possessions he'd accumulated during his brief stay, while Sarah watched the morning light transform the muddy streets into something that might eventually become familiar again. "Think about it," he said, pausing at the wagon's tailgate. "I'll be back through this way in 2 weeks, once the cholera situation is under control. If you're interested in learning medicine, real medicine, not just emergency care, I could use someone with your instincts. And if I'm not interested, then I'll understand. You've got your own life to figure out." Sarah walked beside the wagon as it rolled slowly down Main Street, avoiding the deepest mud holes and the debris that still blocked portions of the roadway. At the town limits, she stopped and watched the wagon disappear over the eastern hills, carrying Dr. Webb toward Junction City and the cholera outbreak that required his immediate attention. She touched the place where the hat box used to rest against her hip, remembering the marriage paper's weight and the careful plans it had represented. Thomas Garrity's proposal offered security, but Dr. Webb's suggestion offered something different: work that mattered, skills that could help people, a partnership based on shared purpose rather than mutual convenience. 2 weeks to decide. 2 weeks to determine whether safety or significance